Edward's reign also saw important structural and institutional changes which helped bring about increased order and stability, and to strengthen the position of the crown vis-à-vis its greatest subjects. Finance was one of the major problems which had blighted the Lancastrian government since the beginning of the 15th century. The crown regularly spent more than it took in taxation and as income from royal lands. The 1460s saw the beginning of the so-called Yorkist land experiment. Edward, in his famous words at the Parliament of 1468, vowed to live of his own. Edward vowed, in other words, to fund his royal government, to fund his household from the profits of royal lands. Royal lands and offices were not to be given out in patronage, but were to be kept by the crown and used to strengthen the crown's financial position. This Yorkist land revenue experiment, as it's been dubbed, was backed up by acts of resumption. There were acts of resumption in 1461, 1465 and 1467. Grants of royal lands and offices were resumed, taken back into the king's hands, and the profits of those offices and lands were kept by the king rather than the royal servant who had received them as a grant under the Lancastrian kings. This in turn encouraged the commons to make generous grants of taxation, and one of the things that we see throughout the 1460s is the willingness of the commons to support Edward's endeavours with generous grants of taxation. Another financial problem that was solved was the problem of the Calais garrison. Calais, a military outpost in France, had proved one of the most costly aspects of English government since its capture by Edward III in 1347. In 1466, with a deal brokered with the merchants of the staple, the wool merchants whose trade was directed through Calais, Edward solved this perennial problem of late medieval government by getting the wool merchants to collect the wool customs themselves and use that to pay the wages of the garrison. By 1471, after the failure of Henry VI's readeption and the defeat of the treacherous Earl of Warwick, Edward emerged as by far the most powerful nobleman and lord in the realm. The royal lands were augmented by the lands of the Earl of Warwick and those lands that were taken from Warwick's erstwhile supporters in 1471. Edward had the financial and the political strength to really impose himself as king during the second part of his reign. The way in which these royal lands acted as guarantees or guarantors of law and order at a local level is evident by the role that Lord Hastings played in the Midlands. As we've seen, Hastings was one of Edward's most trusted supporters and had been raised to the nobility in 1461. In the 1470s, Hastings, who was also the King's Chamberlain, so a key member of the royal household, exercised an authority in the Midlands which was based not upon his private lordship as a great landowner, but as by virtue of his public authority as the King's trusted lieutenant. He was steward of the Duchy of Lancaster lands in the Midlands, and the King's Chamberlain, and the lieutenant of the Calais garrison. These offices were royal offices, and these were the offices which gave Hastings his authority and his power to intervene at a local level to settle disputes on the King's behalf. Hastings' authority, in other words, was Edward's authority, and it was measures like this that were repeated in the southwest, in the north of England, with his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and on the Welsh marches that helped restore law and order in Edward's second reign. We should not overestimate, though, the impact of institutional and structural changes in bringing about an increase in law and order. Problems still persisted. These are evident in the Parliament which was summoned to meet in 1472 and announced Edward's intention to make a campaign in France and to renew the 100 Years' War. In 1472, Edward announced through his Chancellor Bishop Alcock his reasons for going to war with France. The link between external war and internal happiness were made explicit. Law and order was a big issue in the Parliament of 1472. There were a number of notorious cases, including the murder and disembowelment of William Glyn, a Cornwall landowner, which were brought to the attention of the king by the Commons as an example of the kind of disorder which reigned in England because of the fact there was no war with France. The campaign that Edward announced in 1472 took 3 years to materialise, but between his announcement in 1472 and the beginning of the campaign in 1475, numerous proclamations and tracts published between 1472 and 75 made the link between external war and internal peace explicit. Those kings who had not been successful in war, King John, Edward II, Richard II, and Henry VI, were the kings who had failed as rulers at home and who had brought instability to the realm. Those monarchs who had been successful at war, Edward I, Edward III, and Henry V, were the monarchs who had enjoyed peace and stability at home. The 1475 campaign, although inglorious in its outcome, was important for bringing the realm together under Edward as a kingly war leader, emulating the achievements of those great English kings, Edward III and Henry V. It is, nevertheless, I think, all too easy to overstress Edward's successes as king and his successes in restoring order. The 1475 campaign ended in disappointment for all involved. Edward took a pension, took a payment from the French king rather than win glory on the battlefield. And we know that his brother, Richard Duke of Gloucester, his Chamberlain William Lord Hastings, were angry at this, wanted a different outcome. Between 1475 and the end of his reign in 1483, there's a feeling, I think, of disappointment about Edward, a feeling that the king had somewhat took his foot off the pedal. Edward enjoyed, as one chronicler said, the joy of the chase, not the joy of hunting, but more the joy of womanising and feasting. There's a feeling that the lustre had somehow come off Yorkist rule after 1475. Nevertheless, I think it's true to say that Edward made royal government more effectively, and that England was a better governed realm in 1483 than it had been when he had come to the throne in 1461. The changes were, as we've seen, partly institutional. The emphasis on the crown lands and the Acts of Resumption made the crown more powerful in terms of money, made it richer than any of its subjects, and this in turn was translated to political power at a local level. The Acts against retaining and the expansion of the king's household also had an effect of removing the potential for armed bands of retainers to subvert local justice. Above all, though, Edward's reign and Edward's success in restoring order shows the importance of an adult and effective male king. Edward succeeded in restoring order to England after the chaos of the 1450s because he could count on the support of the landowning classes. King, nobles and landowners all shared the same goal. All wanted effective justice and effective royal government. It was not so much Edward who restored order by himself by some miracle of royal policy, but Edward, just by virtue of being a king, by being a king who was an adult and who was active, brought the political nation together with him, and as a whole it was the political nation that restored order to England between 1461 and 1483.